Welcome to the Armchair Constituents, the weekly podcast about news topics. While we're not experts or academics, we do like to speak our voice freely. And keep in mind that as the facts change, so can our opinions.
We are now about to present the main attraction of our world-famous show.
Alright, we're live.
Welcome.
Welcome. This is the fourth episode of the Armchair Constituents. I'm Jeff, and I'm here with Kramer once again. Almost a month. We did back-to-back the first week. No, we did back-to-back the first week, so we still have to wait. Next week will be the month. Technically, it'll be the fifth episode, but it's not. So, I'm not going to go through all the stuff we're going to talk about. We'll just do it one by one. Let's get right into the updates. The USS Carl Vinson arrived in South Korea, finally, to protest, it seems. They're not really too happy about this. We're going to talk about that first, and we'll get into the missile test. But,
yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah. So I mean, it was interesting with THAAD. I mean, I actually learned something about that. I didn't know that it was a mobile thing. It's on trucks. It goes when it hits missiles when they're reaching the peak of their travel, shoots them down. The Chinese aren't excited about it because apparently we'll be more equipped to monitor what's going on with Chinese missiles, and they're worried that if we ever get into a conflict in the future, we'll have this huge leg up. But aside from the Chinese not being excited about it, there's a bunch of South Koreans that aren't excited about it. I read an article where they were talking about to these South Korean farmers, and it's like, I went to bed and I had my farm here, and I woke up and there's a military installation with the defense missile system in my backyard now.
Well, they're also not happy about it because it was approved by an administration that's been deemed corrupt and removed from office. So they want... I don't know how much they don't want it, but they definitely don't want it. They don't want something that was approved by a corrupt regime. They want to wait until they elect their new president and get that in order, then have them do it. Which is fine. Sorry. That's what they want. That's their prerogative. It doesn't help that Trump's running around claiming that they're going to charge Seoul $1 billion for it. Jesus.
We're going to build a missile defense system, and Seoul is going to pay for it. But yeah, I think one of the interesting things about it is I don't know, like you said, whether people just aren't comfortable with the concept of THAAD being there, or if they're just worried about further drawing the ire of North Korea. I mean, I've read some conflicting
it's probably
reports.
that too.
Yeah, I've read some conflicting reports that some say that that the South Koreans are probably gonna elect someone that's a little harder on North Korea, but a lot of what I read has said they want someone who's a little easier, who's not interested in drawing the ire as much. And I mean, I can just imagine if you're a South Korean citizen and you've got North Korea at your border and they're doing missile launches like crazy and their rhetoric is just getting more and more militaristic and incredibly exaggerated, that you just want it to stop and you don't want it to be there. And does it make strategic sense to have a missile defense system like that there? Yeah, 100%. But I can get where they're coming from, where you're just like, please, for the love of God, let it stop. I just want to live my normal life, and I don't want this missile defense system here.
Oh, yeah, if it's true that North Korea has operational nukes, because it's pretty clear that they do have nuclear weapons. Whether or not they can effectively... whether or not it's operational can effectively launch is a different story, considering they keep shooting off these medium-grade ordnance, basically the tests that they did, was it Thursday night? Friday?
I think it was Friday night, yeah.
It's called a KN-17. It's essentially it's an anti-ship ballistic missile, which coincides.
they're gonna knock out the Carl Vinson in one hit. They did say that, so it makes sense they would test it.
But that's what they're shooting off there. I mean, they've done 5 nuclear tests, and I mean that's what a lot of people say. But that's essentially what I think Trump and the administration is waiting for, that 6th test that they're expecting to happen, to be like when they have their grounds to move in. I'm not excited about that. It's too it's not going to be fun to deal with. And I mean,
Yeah.
clearly, I completely understand where South Korea is coming from. You have this other country coming in, setting stuff up, and escalating violence on your border against the wishes of you and your people. It's kind of hard.
Yeah, I mean, especially if they get a new administration in and they don't want THAAD, what are we supposed to do with that? And do we remove it? I mean, with the rhetoric that Trump has been engaging in and the way that he's been behaving, the pressure he's putting, it's going to be a big blow, I guess, to not just credibility, but to image if all of a sudden we're like, oh, okay, well, I guess we're pulling THAAD out. Or if the new South Korean government says we don't want it, we say, no, I'm sorry, screw you, this is staying. It's a really delicate situation.
I'd be willing to bet that that's what they say.
Oh yeah, totally. I think it would be such a
leaving.
loss of face that Donald Trump couldn't stand it. And I mean, also,
they have protests. I mean,
get the strategic element.
They're having protests already against this, blocking oil trucks. They're not going to stand for it, but at the same time, I don't think it's going anywhere. I think we're on a direct route towards some kind of event with North Korea. I don't know how long it's going to take, but it's going there, and it's not going to be avoided at this point. It's too much. There's too many people have too much at stake.
Oh yeah, I mean, all the sabers have been rattled as much as they can be. The chests have been pounded and puffed and such. So I mean, it's just getting more and more, and no one wants to blink in this circumstance. So it's just going to be an inevitability. The question is, if North Korea launches a nuclear missile, if it's a test, do we go then? If it's just a test, do we strike then? If they launch one and it's shot down by THAAD, I mean, do we go in then? What's the point at which something happens? I mean, unless China is willing to step in and do something pretty aggressive.
That's interesting. I mean, the Chinese president is calling for restraint on both sides, like essentially trying to de-escalate something that's just not going to be de-escalated at this point. But I mean, I sent you that article, the New York Times article on the North Korean economy.
Yeah.
Where they're essentially, I mean, they're showing growth in their economy. I mean, still, I mean, it's an impoverished nation, but it's growing. It's growing enough for him to fund his little nuclear tests and his nuclear program.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big subscriber to.
I'm gonna put it in the footnotes of this. I find it pretty interesting. It's basically meaning that they can get away from China, which is China isn't gonna have the same grip. Not that they still have a grip, but they're loosening it slowly.
Yeah, I'm personally a big believer in, sort of in a very broad theoretical sense, that a nice sort of liberalized market can do a lot to stabilize countries that weren't more or less stable. When you have a nice functional economy, people have employment, people have jobs, the economy is doing well and growing. And I mean, by no stretch of the imagination is it doing well, but I mean, you have baby steps for it. It gives people a greater vested interest. It gives people something to lose, as it were. So, I mean, I certainly hope that a nice economic upswing might be something that can stabilize these people so that they are slightly less fatalistic. And I say these people as though the North Korean populace as a whole has some sort of input on what this. Well, I mean,
the article saying the growing economy is affecting the Kim family's grip on the country. Like,
yeah.
As the economy grows and people are able to support themselves more.
But like you say, if they're able to develop a functional economy in some way, it reduces the independence that they have on China, which would kind of ironically be a verification of the Juche, Juche philosophy that Kim Il-sung started with. But
they're saying, okay, so according to this article, it's about 1 to 5% growth since Kim Jong-un has taken over the country. So take that for what you will. It also it has quotes in here, interviews with defectors talking about, like recent defectors talking about like the change in the people's thought processes towards the ruling party because of this like growing independence. It's hard to even say it because it's not like I'm claiming some kind of revolution, but there's stuff happening there. It's not as stagnant as I would have believed a week ago.
It reminds me a little bit. I know when I was in college, this was a big topic of conversation, was the liberalization of the Cuban economy. I mean, for the longest time, you had only a few communist nations or states left on Earth, and China could barely be considered communist after Deng Xiaoping. And Cuba was one of them, but Cuba was going through this very slow economic liberalization process that eventually, opened them up and helped them out. I mean, it was still a dictatorship where people were tortured, but it certainly did help the economic situation a little bit. I don't know. I think we should look up a little bit, maybe, and discuss with an update next week about what exactly some of these reforms are that have led to a bit of a jump in the Korean, the North Korean economy.
Right. I mean, I can say without a fact that there will be an update on North Korea next week.
Oh, yeah.
As it has every week since we started this program.
Even if the update it's still there, it's still an exciting update.
So, second update, French elections. So, I can't remember if we reported last week if the election results were in when we ended, but Macron came in first by a narrow margin. He and Marine Le Pen, are going to the runoff election, which will be held a week from today.
Yeah, that's pretty exciting. And with his victory there, I mean, even Mélenchon got 19.6% of the popular vote, and he said that people that voted for him should not vote for Macron, but vote against Le Pen. So, from what I read earlier today, it looks like Macron is predicted to win with 59 to 60% of the vote. So, I mean, that's pretty interesting.
Right.
I'm a little surprised, honestly, that Mélenchon would say to go with Macron, since, I mean, he does share a decent amount of commonality with Le Pen and a lot of rhetoric that they have and a lot of the vote pool that they're pulling from. I mean, they're pulling from industrial working class neighborhoods, and they have some pretty similar policies. Some of Le Pen's are just a little more xenophobic than Mélenchon's.
Yeah, well, a little more.
Being polite.
Nobody's controlling us. But I mean, I was reading this last night. Like, do you know anything about Macron? Like, what is his policy? Like, the unemployment rate in France is what, like 9.6%?
Basically 10. And it's been that way for a long time, decades.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of those things where you can almost see how somebody like this, Le Pen, I'm referring to, could get to the status that she is. That's to have for a decade to have 10% unemployment. That's I mean, in Germany's pretty close to that too, correct? Or over that.
I thought Germany was like 3, but I might be wrong. We should look that up real quick. But I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that you can see that someone like that would be popular. But I don't know. I don't know too much about Macron's policies specifically. I know that he worked in the Hollande government, and he was a finance minister, and he left the Hollande government because he was so frustrated that he couldn't do anything there. He wanted to be able to become more business friendly, so that France could tackle the unemployment issue. But interestingly, I read an article earlier today and said a majority of French citizens aren't confident that either Le Pen or Macron would be able to help with the unemployment situation or to deal with the terrorist attacks that France is having right now. I say right now, because it's so popular in the modern consciousness.
Germany's at 3.9%. So I don't know.
I also wonder,
I don't know what I'm talking about.
How do EU countries measure unemployment? Do they do it the same way that the U.S. does? Because if we say you're not looking for work anymore, you aren't considered unemployed. And I know that for a lot of people, I used to be one of those people, but I get the rationale behind it now. That's a really big point. And if you take that into account, ours is way higher. So I wonder how they measure their unemployment. I'm sure someone out there knows that, because
I don't know. I mean, as a whole, the EU's unemployment is about 9.4%.
That's really high.
Yeah, But I'm just
Thanks,
looking
Spain
through
and
like
Portugal,
the world
France.
unemployment. There was another country that I was listening to. It doesn't matter because I'm not going to keep staring at this, but it's just a list of numbers.
Yeah, the other thing with the French elections, I think we touched on it a little bit last week, but a lot more has come out about Le Pen's financing and
Right.
her
That's like the meat
connections with the
of this
Kremlin.
update.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, there's just clear ties. I mean, they're
Yeah, there was
open. Like what
there was a
were we
BBC
looking at?
article.
13.5 million euros, basically loaned out from Russian banking institutions to the National Front. Is that what it was?
Yeah. So there's a BBC article. We'll put it in the chat so we can link to it. There was one for 11 million euros that happened in 2014. And just trying to go through it and see if I can find any more. There was another loan in 2016, but I can't remember the exact amount. But all of these are coming from Kremlin-connected banks.
So they donated. Well, not donated. There was a 2.5 million euro loan. Keep wanting to say dollar to the Cyprus. It was a holding company from a holding company belonging to a former KGB agent. This was in 2014, but they donated. It was loaned out to the Kotelet, a financial branch of the National Front. I don't know about the other one in 2016. I only have two.
There was another one from the first Czech Russian bank, and that was the 11 million euro loan. And it's what's most interesting about this is that they're thanks to some I think they were Ukrainian hackers. There's explicit text messages between Kremlin officials and people with the National Front that was basically accusations of quid pro quo, that if Le Pen comes out and supports Russia's annexation of Crimea, that they'll give her money, and they did. And there's a text going to this National Front official saying, "Oh yeah, we need to repay Le Pen now because no French bank will give the National Front any type of loan because of their history with Jean-Marie."
You don't even need those text messages when when the financial records show that this much money was loaned, and it coincides with this pro-Russian statement.
Yeah. What's also interesting is that Le Pen is lying about when she met Putin, because she met him, and I think it was back in mid to late 2016.
No, it was 2013. That was when she first went to Moscow.
Oh yeah, and her dad apparently she and her father are not on good terms. I get it. You kicked him out of the party and whatnot, but her dad is saying, "Oh no. She met him way before that. They've met plenty of times, and no one wants to, say too much about that." So. More updates, but it's funny that this update isn't even remotely surprising.
After the election last Sunday, the first place she went was the Kremlin to have a one-on-one, basically meeting with Putin, a publicity stunt, almost presidential. She went to meet with a foreign leader.
A lot of what I've heard is that. Basically, Russia will be happy with anyone that's not Macron, because Mélenchon wants to leave the EU. The National Front wants to leave the EU and help ease sanctions on Russia. And Fillon wanted to...
Le Pen, in her meeting with Putin this week, vowed to cancel the Russian sanctions.
Yeah. And Fillon wanted to have better relations with Russia. The only person that wants to be more involved in the European Union has a big interest in breaking up the EU, because instead of having to negotiate with a massive economic bloc, they can negotiate with individual people. They have a huge financial and potentially military and strategic interest in getting these big nations out of the EU. Right. So that's France, basically. What you said, that the second round is next week?
Yeah, the 7th.
Okay.
But, yeah, as I just messaged you, your voice cut out there about midway through that last sentence. But
it wasn't anything that important.
Well, so those are the updates. Now let's get into the topics. We want to start with Berkeley and Ann Coulter, right? You want to go into that?
Yeah. Sort of Ann Coulter.
You want a little backdrop on what happened? I don't know if you... Well, I know you looked into it. But essentially, Ann Coulter was scheduled to speak organization called the Young America's Foundation was hosting her at I'm assuming a campus-approved location. It had been set up, and protesters were essentially threatening violence. And they canceled it, rescheduled it, and I believe they canceled it again. Or I think Coulter and her people said that they wouldn't do it, and now the Young America's Foundation is suing UC Berkeley for free speech violations. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I know Gavin McGinnis read her speech that she was supposed to give there, apparently. Yeah, I guess it was... I don't necessarily want to hit on Coulter specifically, but Coulter is the most recent iteration of what's going on at Berkeley. I mean, first you had, Milo, and then you had Charles Murray, and Charles Murray had probably one of the most ridiculous reactions. I mean, for those of you who don't know, Charles Murray is a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and he was really famous for a book in the 90s called The Bell Curve. And basically he was arguing that there is great racial disparity in education, not necessarily based off of circumstantial factors to access to education in minority neighborhoods, but based off of fundamentally racial differences in people determine who is more intelligent than another person. It has been widely debunked, and there's really no one that takes it seriously. But nonetheless, there was a huge reaction to his arrival. Even a liberal professor at UC Berkeley ended up getting a concussion. The protesters lit a limousine on fire. Coulter is the most recent iteration, and Milo is planning on going back and giving a talk on May 5th, and Richard Spencer is planning on going there in the fall. So these things just keep escalating. But I think what I find most interesting about this whole Berkeley thing is sort of the shift that's happened in the campus speech movement. I mean, you go a couple of years back and you had articles by people like Greg Lukianoff and John Haidt, like the one in the Atlantic I'm a big fan of, called The Coddling of the American Mind. And people were talking about trigger warnings and safe spaces and all of these things that really talk about the emotional fragility of people. And it seems like this shift has happened, and it was, I don't want to say militarized, because it comes across a little paranoid or a little alt-righty, but the massive shift in it all at once to now even traditionally progressive outlets are saying, Berkeley, Antifa crowd, protesters that don't like Donald Trump, you're kind of behaving in a ridiculous way that is making you look bad. And I think for me, that's what's one of the most frustrating things about this entire issue, is that the right is putting forward a very good strategy and the left is just playing into it perfectly. The right is putting forward people on purpose to anger the left. Milo Yiannopoulos is a great example of someone you can bring in to anger people. That's all he is. He's a provocateur. He's a firebrand. He just wants to piss people off. So you have protests, and then you progressively get more and more mainstream with it. Charles Murray, not quite mainstream, but not as aggressive as Milo. Then you go over to Ann Coulter. Ann Coulter is like one of the most mainstream conservative commentators, and people are rioting and behaving the same way. And I understand the goal of the right. They are trying to point out the implied hypocrisy of the left, that the left is supposed to be peaceful. And it's a good tactic. I mean, I think it's cheap and one-dimensional, but the left is playing right into it. They are giving the alt-right exactly what they want. And I also think it's funny that if you listen to the way that both of these sides talk, they say the exact same thing. Both sides feel that their beliefs are marginalized. The Antifa crowd, the really, the Black Bloc and all the groups like that are concerned about the marginalization of their views. They're concerned about oppression and fighting an unfair system. And you can look at the alt-right and see the same thing. Well, our beliefs are marginalized because we're conservative in the realm of higher education. Our views are repressed because we don't fit in with a liberal order, and we're fighting the unfair system of higher education. And it's funny, they both accuse each other of being keyboard warriors, and I mean, they both are keyboard warriors, and they're both absolutely crazy. And it's incredibly frustrating watching this whole thing unfold, where these two completely moronic groups that are saying virtually the exact same thing are beating the crap out of each other and lighting everything on fire. Sorry,
Yeah.
I went on a touch of a rant there.
Well, yeah, but I mean that's just the case. That's just exactly the case. I mean, you have organizations like Oath Keepers that are descending on these places that are essentially. I mean, you have the Antifa. Like they're essentially a militia. That's what they go there for. They don't go there to protest. They go there to stop what they view as oppressive speech.
Yeah, they go there to punch a Nazi in the face because free speech
and then you
isn't
have
free
the
speech.
Oath Keepers that come down to, in their view, protect free speech through violence. So that you have these two violent entities that are just there to fight. It's just they're militias, and it's absurd. It's completely ridiculous. And you have this right now. You have this one place which seems to be UC Berkeley seems to be like the epicenter. If you're a alt-right conservative order of any kind, you go to UC Berkeley to make sure that you get all across the social medias, because that's what will happen. They will know. They will find out that you're going. They'll descend on it, and then you'll have your own little militia come in, and then you'll be all over Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat and Twitter. Everybody will be talking about you for the next 2 weeks until the next person decides to show up, and then they'll talk about them. But yeah, you're right. It's completely a strategy. But then you have people like Abby Martin who want to completely blame conservatives because it's the conservatives' fault. They shouldn't be going to UC Berkeley because they know this is going to happen. They should just let these people have their safe space, their bubble. The whole thing is ridiculous.
Just like a walking Breitbart parody of what someone that goes to UC Berkeley sounds like.
Yeah.
This is a liberal bastion.
For people that don't know what we're talking about, Abby Martin was on Joe Rogan's podcast this week. I don't remember what day of the week, but you can look it up. She says a lot of things that are very stupid. But yeah, this is essentially what it is, and it's happening constantly. And you're right. We both sound exactly the same because we're both just so exhausted. There is no right and wrong in this situation. Like, Ann Coulter should be allowed to speak. If the organization is paying for her, they're approved, she should be allowed to speak. These people should be allowed to protest, but they're not protesting. This isn't a protest. You're allowed to peacefully protest. You're not allowed to block streets, punch people, light stuff on fire. That's not the same thing.
Yeah. I think one of the more subtle frustrations that I have about this is that this entire circumstance is breeding a false dichotomy very aggressively. And it's framed in such a way that you either support the Antifa movement or you support, the what was the group that you were talking about from the alt-right?
Well, they're a conservative militia, the Oath Keepers.
Yeah. But yeah, the Oath Keepers. You either fall into one of these two categories. I mean, I found myself doing the exact same thing because I really dislike the alt-right movement as whole. I despise populism, left or right, and when we touch on Venezuela in a bit, I'll dig into that. I hate all forms of populism. When you try to run a government that way, I understand it's an important tool to influence, but I despise all forms of populism. So I have this gut reaction where I'm like, I cannot stand these groups on the right. And so I have this knee-jerk of, support Antifa, and then I have to remind myself, these people are also morons. And I've got a lot of friends that have this exact same thing. They're more conservative than I am, and so their first thing is, so when that guy punched that Antifa protester, that gal in the face, they were immediately like, good on him because she was there to do violence, and I'm like, they were there to do violence too.
You're referring to one of the first protests where there was just the girl in the red hat. The guy runs up and punches her, and then another guy maces her.
No, this was from one a couple weeks back.
Okay.
The
first one, the one I'm referring to, the girl was wearing a hat that said "Make Bitcoin Great Again," and these two mid-40s anti-fascists run up to her, rip the hat off without even reading it. They just see a red hat with words on it, rip it off. One guy punches her in the face, and the other guy maces her. And
good job, Left.
Good job on
I'm
you.
talking about
You showed
one.
her.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
go ahead.
definitely
I thought you were talking about
by
that. I
Bob
wanted to be like,
Reed.
I wanted to point out how
Yeah.
stupid they are.
Yeah, no, the one I'm talking about was the one from a couple weeks back, where the guy, he was a student at UC Berkeley or UC Santa Barbara. He's a student at one of the UCs. And there's a video, someone was like Facebook live streaming it, and he just runs up and decks this girl. And she's got dreadlocks, and she gets interviewed after. And 4chan got on the trail, and they were like, "Oh, she was throwing bottles, so she earned it." And I'm like, we have zero context about what was going on beforehand, and it immediately split people. And I fell victim to it too. Some of my friends were like, "Nope, she earned it. She should have been punched in the face." And I'm like, that is an overreaction. We don't have no context beyond a picture that 4chan says of that she's throwing bottles. And I'm not going to buy too much of what 4chan says, but. It's frustrating that it split us immediately, and I went into the defensive posture of, okay, I'm gonna defend the left in this circumstance.
Well,
I have to constantly remind myself.
Wasn't it originally framed as she was hit for some kind of like a cultural appropriation type deal, where she was, because she had dreads as a white female? That was what it was.
I don't even know, but it. I mean, it may have been that, but it's so funny. Like it will. A lot of the conversations will do like where you and I are doing now. Okay, well, what's the details? Was it right? Was it justifiable? Am I okay to defend this person? I have to constantly remind myself both of these groups are idiots, and they aren't doing anything productive. They are making their points just worse and worse and worse. And it's, I mean, it's like some students in California were on a hunger strike, and the college Republicans at a barbecue next to them. I mean, things are just getting so petty in places like this. And
petty.
It's so
petty
funny.
Isn't even that bad. It's when you have these people that, like, everybody gets upset, and you're like, God, fuck that guy, fuck him, he's an asshole, and that's as far as you go, because you're a normal human. But then you have these people that have their beliefs, and they're so indoctrined in this academia where they're so right. They're so right, and everybody needs to accept that. And if you don't accept that, I'm going to punch you because you're a Nazi and that's what you deserve. Or you're anti-fascist and that's what you deserve. No, that's not how a world works. Like, at some point, they're going to wake up, and there's consequences to what they're doing. This is kind of stuff that's going to follow them. I don't think they're as faceless as they pretend to be.
Yeah. You know what's really interesting, though, is a lot of the Berkeley stuff and a lot of the over-the-top antics or shenanigans are really the youth. You go to the Midwest, for instance, look at Kansas. After the election, there was a really interesting shakeup in basically the political continuum. And you had a lot of Republicans that switched over in a recent election that they had in Kansas and voted Democrat, and some Democrats that voted Republican. And it's really interesting because these were all older people who were just realizing that they had been so dedicated to the left-right dichotomy their entire lives that when Donald Trump comes along and basically rips the left-right dichotomy apart so that it is essentially meaningless, that there was a big shift in how people voted. And it was interesting. They did interviews with these people from this election in Kansas, and the Republican won, but the Democrat came very, very close, which is surprising, much like what was going on with Ossoff in Georgia. And they were talking about people were a little more open to ideas because the political spectrum had been ripped apart, and they were thinking about themselves more and more as sort of individual people as opposed to dedication to a party, which also makes me think, did you see that The Guardian posted this story where they had 5 conservatives and 5 progressives only consume the type of media that was biased against them for like a month?
No. What?
Oh, it was great. So they had 5 like hardcore Trump voters only consume like HuffPo, New York Times, Democracy Now!, MoveOn.org, all this. And they had 5 like raging liberals consume nothing but Fox and Breitbart and all of this. And it was hilarious watching them because they got a big shift, and some people got more emboldened in their views, but some were like, I get why people behave this way now. I get why people that I don't agree with behave the way that they do. And because these people make good points and my really biased news sources aren't making the points these other really biased news sources are making, and that in the balance of consuming both, there may be a lightening of the shades of gray, as it were.
Right. I mean, I think there is.
Sorry, I went off on
You have
another
this.
one there.
Well, you have this whole new thing where, I mean, a lot of people have known about news bias and all that involves that encompasses this media bias. But I think with this most recent election, at least in the United States, people have it's opened their eyes, and now they don't just buy whatever their media outlet says 100%. Now, that's a generalized statement because there's definitely people that still are, but there's a growing sentiment that you should look into what you're reading as news instead of just accepting it. I've said this, like, Trump's going to do a lot of bad things or attempt to, but he's also making people more aware of what the government is doing and trying to do. People are more involved. Maybe not in the best ways, but they're more involved. They're trying to find that silver lining. So I get what you're going for.
Yeah, Dan Carlin touched on that, and he was like, maybe he was looking at a silver lining for Trump. And he's like, maybe it is just that sometimes something really bad comes along and it just startles people into action. I mean, he said the same thing the day after the election. I was listening to his podcast, Common Sense, or the day after the election, I think. And I mean, I think that is a perfectly legitimate point. One thing that bothers me is that, you know, people, some more conservative folks will say, "Oh, Obama was doing horrible, terrible things too," and you know, now you're jumping on Trump for doing them. It's like, well, no one is pardoning. You know, at least in you, myself, a lot of the circles I travel in, no one is pardoning Barack Obama for some of the horrible things that he did. I mean, I think that the way that Obama escalated the drone war was absolutely disgusting. The complete violation of Fourth Amendment rights, I think, are awful. But if people are becoming more conscious and being more aggressive on a president who seems to blatantly want to further expand the executive in a way that I consider dangerous, then more power to him. If he just happens to be conservative and we're reaming on this conservative president a little bit more, sorry, you're just going to have to take it. Trump has also destroyed whatever it means to be a conservative, so conservatives should also be happy about people attacking Trump more. Or being more involved, I should say.
Right. Yeah. No, I don't have anything
shoes
else
roll slippery from my soapbox.
Yeah, I don't have anything else to add to this, so I'm gonna rough transition into Saudi Arabia. So let's go right down that rabbit hole.
Speaking of things that happened in the news,
yeah. So Saudi Arabia was elected to the UN's Women's Rights Commission. So let's talk about that. They're one of the now 45 countries sitting on the panel that is the sole purpose to promote women's rights across worldwide. If you don't know a lot about Saudi Arabia, women in Saudi Arabia have no rights. They have a guardian, whether it be their father, husband, brother, son, that makes all their life decisions for them from the day they're born until the day they die. They can't drive cars. They can't travel abroad. No passports. If they file abuses against their guardians or anyone in their family, they can be jailed for disobedience. There's several cases in the news recently of women escaping Saudi Arabia only to be detained by airport security personnel on aircraft and then deported or returned back to Saudi Arabia.
Jesus,
to
it's
be
like
jailed.
Dred Scott. Oh my God.
It is a shitty kingdom. It's not a country. It's a kingdom. They have a king. It's
basically a theocracy.
I don't know how. The UN is trying to frame it as they're doing better in women's rights. They just recently started better. In March. They started a girls' council that consisted
they're letting women go to school now and hold jobs.
Yeah,
wow.
I don't actually know if that's true, but they started a girls' council. It consists of men and women, mostly men.
Naturally.
The women involved have to sit in a separate room while the 13 men do the work. I don't know why the women are there. All I know is that at the media like the presser where they were talking about it. They had 13 men on stage, and they referenced women that were obliged to sit in the other room. So, but apparently they're doing better, and they deserve a seat on a council to promote women's rights worldwide. While they behead women in the streets and hang them from scaffolding because they were convicted of stealing or something.
Yeah.
That's a
When I first heard this, I thought, okay, this has to be like a small vote. Like 2 people sat in a room and made this decision, and one was absent that day, and the other person that was supposed to make the decision was, a representative from Saudi Arabia. But this passed with a vote of 47 to 54. Like, that's a substantial majority of people in the United Nations that think a country with one of the worst women's rights records in modernity, potentially in history, should be on a council that is there to promote the rights of women. That is completely mind-boggling. And they had an interview with the Belgian Prime Minister Charles Michel on the UN Watch, and he said that he issued a statement of regret for helping to elect Saudi Arabia onto this council. His rationale was, the vote came up quickly and I didn't have time to read through it. For me, that seems like a no-brainer. Of like, seriously, like, oh hey, just real quick, can I just gauge your opinion, yes or no? Should Saudi Arabia be involved in
anything?
Making rules for women? I'm going to go ahead and go no. Oh, okay, just checking.
Yeah.
He says if he could go back and vote against it, he would have. Which, I mean, that makes me feel better. That he, given a week or so, to realize that was a bad decision.
Probably couldn't, because he already spent the money that they paid him.
Yeah, seriously.
But
I just like. Yeah. I mean, I
don't know. I just find it ridiculous. I mean, the biggest thing, just the stuff, researching the stuff this country does to women and are allowed to do to women. It's just insane that they are they're allies with the United States. Fairly well documented allies.
And fairly well documented people that finance global terrorism really aggressively.
Yep.
There's a really good book written in I think it's 2008 or 2009 by Robert Lacey called Inside the Kingdom. It's a follow-up to his work in the 1980s called The Kingdom, which is a tome. This is maybe 250, 300 pages. And he dedicates a portion of the book, probably the last quarter of it, to talking about modern feminist movements in Saudi Arabia, and how there are some princes within the Saudi royal family that are progressive, even by European standards. Maybe not Western European standards, but European standards as a continent. And they want more rights for women, but they get drowned out by the rest of the royal family, and the fact that when they have votes in Saudi Arabia, these conservative religious zealots win constantly. I think it was in the late 90s, maybe early 2000s. He interviewed a feminist activist in Saudi Arabia, which is that sentence alone is amazing. And she organized driving protests with females. They would borrow cars from their brothers and their husbands or their sons, and they would all get in them, and they would just drive around this massive traffic circle in Riyadh, and in Saudi Arabia and in some other Muslim majority countries. They have a group called the Mutaween, which is just religious police, basically. I think in Saudi Arabia, it's the Council for the Protection of Virtue and the Prevention of Vice. And these guys are freaking out because there's women driving. They went around this traffic circle like 10 times before someone finally noticed a woman was driving. And nothing happened. There were no wrecks, but they freaked out. And they made these women pull over. They stopped them in the traffic circle, forced them out of the vehicles, had their male relatives come and get them. And I mean, this was 20 years ago. And I mean, so they've made progress. I read something the other day that they've made it a little easier for women to get education, and they've opened up the labor market a touch, I think. But if that is your definition of progress, you have allowed women, you've made it easier for women to contribute to your economy. That is that bar is incredibly low.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I don't want. I'm not gonna delve deep into this because I haven't investigated it enough to really speak. But the stuff that goes on over there is documented well enough for anyone on a UN council to go, no, they probably shouldn't be on a council for women's rights, human rights, environmental rights, anything involving rights.
Anything involving people, the planet, stuff like that.
We should just. But anyway, let's go back. We're going. You wanted to talk about the double execution Monday night, last Monday in Arkansas.
Yeah. So Arkansas did its the first double executions that's occurred in the United States in quite a long time, and there was some controversy over it. I know you and I have very differing opinions on the death penalty. We don't want to get into a big death penalty debate, but there were reports there that said, basically the drug midazolam just basically wasn't working, and then there was gasping. The man was clearly in pain. What interests me more about this, not necessarily just the death penalty, is I guess the background to all of these cases. For me, the rationale behind the state of Arkansas's decision to execute these men is a little weird. Their supply of midazolam runs out today. It expires, and they can no longer legally use it. And they realize this, and this stuff is in short supply. Apparently, it's rather hard to get. And they're like, oh, crap, we need to kill all these guys real quick. And 2 of them were killed. 3 of them had stays of execution. I don't think they had pardons, and I'm not sure about the other 2. They were up, but I didn't hear about it. But I don't know. For me, it's a bad reason to accelerate executions, but also some of the background that goes into it. I mean, with these 8 inmates, I think it's 5 of them have mental disorders, rather severe mental disorders. A couple of them have IQs of about 70. Then one of them suffers from schizophrenia. He just literally doesn't know what's going on. He sees dogs and people everywhere. 2 or 3 of them had horrible representation in the court system. One of the inmates' attorneys kept showing up drunk. Another one, his attorney did not even know that she was representing him. He got a letter from her that said, "Oh, I'm retiring. I'm not reading your case anymore." And he contacted her about it, and she had no idea who this guy was. For me, it's just just sort of, I guess, a sad state of affairs that all of these things have sort of culminated in this.
Right. Yeah. I don't really want to get into the death penalty or anything around with it, because I mean, I've looked into a lot of these guys. There is, I'll concede the argument about the mental health issues. Like I definitely agree that this country's privatized prisons and for-profit, I guess, police departments, where they're essentially just arresting people to make sure that the police and the prison system has enough money to keep afloat or make profit. Meanwhile, we defund mental health institutions at an alarming rate. I mean, that kind of stuff is ridiculous. I mean, like the suffering, the inhumane suffering that they're claiming for these botched lethal injections. All the articles say that it's unsubstantiated. It's just reports that they're getting from inside that's what happened. I don't agree that they should.
Sorry, go ahead.
I don't agree that they should have sped it up. Like, if these people hadn't gone through correct due process and they were speeding it up, then no, that's wrong. But I don't know. I mean, the 2 that were executed were confessed rapists and murderers. They wrote letters claiming that they had gotten better in prison, and one started practicing Buddhism. That's good for him. But I don't have sympathy.
Hey, forgiving yourself is the first step.
I don't have sympathy for that kind of act once you cross that threshold. If you have, I mean, somebody that's schizophrenic or has a severe mental illness, that should fall under different categories that this country chooses to defund, which goes into a whole slew of other issues this country has with violence and crime. But I'm being very rigid on this because I'm not trying to get too far into it.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a, for me, it's, again, we don't want to get into a conversation about the death penalty, but it is just such an interesting and sad story that you have bad representation, issues with the mental health system, a debate about the death penalty in a very broad, practical and philosophical sense, in conjunction with, this use of a drug that's running out. It just seems, it's such a, and again, Jesus, I don't want to sound like CNN or anything, but it's incredibly sad that this has come to, I guess just this turn of events. I don't know. I just found it to be particularly interesting, but it's kind of one of those, we aren't going to debate the death penalty, so here's some facts behind it. It's a weird, unfortunate circumstance.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's get out of these woods. We're all about the rough transitions. That's all we do. We just slap cut this together. So Venezuela. I'm just gonna
cross out Arkansas execution on my notes here, and we're done.
We're going into the Venezuelan protests, the most recent ones coming after, what was it, 2 weeks ago, when the National Assembly was stripped of powers by President Maduro. Is that how you say his name?
Maduro.
Yes. So far 2 have died, hundreds are injured, millions in the streets protesting. The president of Venezuela, Maduro, is in Cuba, or was in Cuba, claiming that there's peace in Venezuela.
Bold statement.
While his military is dropping tear gas canisters onto protesters from helicopters, and it's just, I mean, this is another case similar to Turkey, where they're stripping the legislative and judiciary powers and essentially going from a democracy to a dictatorship against their people's will. Even I would say even worse than Turkey, clearly, because there was no vote on this. It was just done. At least in Turkey, there was a guise of a vote.
Yeah, at least they pretended. It was thoughtful that they put forward the facade. Yeah, when Maduro first came to power, it coincided with a massive drop in the price of oil, which, natural resource curse for the nation of Venezuela, that tanked their economy. And right before we got on, I saw that Maduro had conceded to raise the minimum wage to $3 a day in an effort to sort of satiate the people. But I'm actually really glad you brought up Turkey, because there was a really interesting New York Times article I think we should link in the description of the video that talked about this and talked about what happened in Venezuela. Because in 1999, when Hugo Chavez got elected, he was supposed to be the next big thing. He rode in on the backs of fighting corruption, and Venezuela was horribly corrupt. I mean, literally, the Supreme Court in Venezuela had a fee system set up, so that, okay, you paid this amount for this particular type of case, so you get the outcome that you want. And it's really interesting that the big fundamental difference I see between Turkey and Venezuela is that with Turkey, I see this as a concerted effort to become a dictator. It's the end goal, and it's been the end goal for a while. With Venezuela, sorry, gotta clear my throat. With Venezuela, the shift to a dictatorship almost seems more of a result of actions than a goal. And it kind of speaks to populism as a whole. And this is kind of what I wanted to get into about why I dislike populism. Hugo Chavez comes into power rightfully saying that there is rampant corruption all over Venezuela, and we're going to take care of these things. But instead of reforming them, he basically just dismantles them. He packs the court. He expands the court by more than 50%, the Supreme Court, and packs them with people that he wants. So he gets the court rulings that he wants. He destroys all these institutions that safeguard democracy. I mean, aside from packing the court, he takes some power from the court. He gets rid of all these non-elected bureaucratic institutions. he takes control of the media. He formed new unions, and if people did not join those new unions, he cracks down on the existing unions so that he had control over labor unions. And all this is done in the guise of almost like being the vanguard of the people, that true populist sense of knowing what real Venezuelans want in fighting the corrupt political bureaucracy for the body politic of the people. And it's just assuming power slowly and slowly with time, so that this cult of personality is built. Because as far as these people know, and especially with the control of the media that the Venezuelan government has, this, people like Hugo Chavez are going out and they're doing things for you. You just need to believe in him. This cult of personality forms, and you just get imbued with as much power as you want, so to a point that you control everything that goes on in the country. And it's just fortunate or unfortunate, I guess, however you want to interpret it, he died and oil prices tanked, and his successor is dealing with the fallout of what's going on.
Well, yeah, I mean, currently the Venezuelan government's claiming that there's plenty of food, there's well-stocked hospitals that are there just to aid the people. Meanwhile, I mean, they're in the streets because there isn't food. They're forming their own farms and co-ops to feed themselves, but they can't get basic medical care to take care of themselves. It's that amid a drastic economic downfall. Their economy is it's falling apart. And then we reported last week that the government donated $500,000, correct, or $500 million
to the inauguration.
Right? Was it $500,000?
I think it was $500,000. I think it was $500,000. I was saying $500 million. Good God.
But
yeah, I mean, even some of the private businesses are, they're hoarding food and waiting for prices to go up.
Well, from what I've read, the food isn't necessarily a problem, because they're building these co-ops that are actually fairly successful, where they're having their own little farming communities, and so I mean, in the large cities, it probably is a huge problem, but in the surrounding area, these co-ops are doing very well to feed people. At least that's what I'm reading. So take that for what you will. That's from the Interpreter and New York Times and all that stuff. But back to what Maduro's doing. I mean, they're jailing opposition leaders, politicians that are speaking out against the government and its practices. It's drastic. I mean, there's only so much we can actually say about it, because we didn't say anything last week because there just wasn't enough to go off of, at least in my eyes. And this week, it's still hard, but it's something that needs to be brought up, and it'll be more than likely part of our updates every week.
Yeah, and again, to beat a horse that if not dead, for me, this is sort of the epitome of my issues with populism. And I think it is important to watch the rise of populism across Western Europe, and especially with the German elections coming up in September, with the French runoff election coming up next week. When is the when is the UK elections? UK
election
is June 8th.
Okay, well, that's not far.
But I mean, especially with sort of the push and pull that's going on with traditional conservatism and the populist nationalism in America, and specifically in the White House, that's influencing our policies, I think it's important to watch and sort of just, I guess, understand the rhetoric and the strategy of populism and what can come of it. I mean, you can't run populism and democracy just don't work together. I mean, you cannot have a populist democracy, because you get the tyranny of the majority very quickly, and you end up with people like Hugo Chavez, strong men who can amass control with a cult of personality, and they like we talked about the other week, populists put forward simple solutions to complex problems. They're taking a machete to red tape and anything else that they want to take a machete to simplify everything, because it's just easier if a handful of people can make the decisions, and people buy it because nobody likes the IRS. Great, let's take the machete to the IRS. Nobody likes a lot of unelected bureaucrats that have control. But the solution isn't necessarily to destroy those things. One of the things that the Times article touched on was that, while there was a lot of corruption, and I'm sure there continues to be a lot of corruption in Venezuela, that the efforts that Hugo Chavez did to dismantle these bureaucratic institutions, because they were unelected bureaucrats that were controlling people's lives, have led to so many larger problems, because these are the cogs and gears that keep a country running. They aren't popular, they're slow, they are expensive, but they keep a country and they keep a democracy running. And it's really easy to look at these things and go, oh, we'll just get rid of them. They're stupid. They cost us a ton of money. But you kind of need them to function. Like the EPA, things like that.
Well, we're trying to get rid of the EPA.
Oh, I mean, obviously they're useless. They do nothing but push propaganda about how climate change is happening, which we all know isn't. And states now, there's a lot of now there's the big push for states to be able to teach the controversy all over again. What once was evolution is now climate change.
Well, that's not going to happen. We hope.
We also said Trump wasn't going to get elected, and that definitely happened.
We have, you forget who is in charge of the education department. That's the religious zealot.
Boss.
Yes, she's not going to. I don't know how someone that's as idiotic and uneducated as that is in charge of American education. But it's just a number of sad things. But speaking of sad things in the United States, here's a good transition right into sanctuary cities, executive orders. So let's look at to this week. Judge William Orrick III, U.S. District Judge.
So regal.
Excuse me?
I just said his name was so regal.
Right. Well, okay, so he denied the executive order that is basically telling sanctuary cities across the country that if they do not uphold the federal immigration requests, they would be denied local funds, federal funds, to their police force, essentially. Now, Judge Orrick is claiming that the executive order's language is obscure enough to where they could deny federal funds to more than just law enforcement agencies, which is the grounds in which he overturned it, I guess is the language I should use. So yeah.
This is like the No Child Left Behind of immigration issues. Hey, if you don't cooperate with us on immigration issues, we're going to defund your police force.
Well, the interesting part is, from what I've gathered, these sanctuary cities aren't using these funds for their police force, or at least not for the use of immigration requests. So I don't understand. Where this is going.
First of all, the president can't just do that. That's a congressional thing. You can't just say you're not getting any money anymore. There's a whole process with Congress for determining what money goes where. I don't know what Donald Trump thinks his powers are, but you can't just do that. But secondly, there's a good argument I've heard for this. And people who are big fans of federalism and are big fans of preventing the overreach of federal authorities or the militarization of police, it's not local police's job to enforce federal law. That is not their job. That is the role of the federal government. That is the role of Customs and Border Patrol. Local police shouldn't be handling immigration issues. I think that's a decently solid argument. Aside from the fact that the president can't defund these people, mine totally went blank. It's not the role of the local authorities to do these things. And yeah, sorry, that's my initial point.
Well, the argument, the opposite direction is, these sanctuary cities, they essentially prohibit federal agencies from coming in and enforcing immigration.
See, I thought it was that
they have ways to shield.
They didn't want local police force to
they don't
as much.
They don't enforce it, but they don't cooperate. They either refuse or prohibit agencies from complying with the immigration policies. They don't detain or any of that kind of stuff.
But even then, defining what a sanctuary city is very difficult. There is no 100% agreed upon definition. And like Matt Welch talked about, I mean, the history of a sanctuary city is people fleeing from the drug war and the violence and finding shelter and another life in a city or a county or a town that's welcoming to them.
I mean,
hate how the
you're
concept
right.
of sanctuary cities
There's
is
not
distorted.
there's not a clear definition, but you can Google sanctuary cities, and there's a clearly defined list of every. There's 4 states that are considered sanctuary states, and then there are cities all the way through. I mean, every state has multiple, from what I can see, except for Milwaukee. Wisconsin has Milwaukee. That's the only one. They have one.
Huh. For me, I ignoring the principled, ideological, philosophical argument, I just don't think it's worth it to put this much emphasis on it for a few reasons. One, there's been a lot of studies that have come out in the past few years that indicate counties and cities and towns with high immigrant populations, illegal or otherwise, have drastically lower crime rates. And illegal immigrants also help the police out a lot because they have a vested interest in their communities not being violent because they don't want that increased police presence there. So statistically, it has been noted substantially over the past few years that more immigrants, as I said, illegal or otherwise, legal or illegal, they do have substantially lower crime rates than native-born Americans. The other point is that I think that this is the idea of trying to force this much more aggressive immigration stance in conjunction with Donald Trump's trade policies is the most counterproductive and oxymoronic thing. If you want people to stay in the places they are, you need their economy to work properly. You need there to be less violence. You need there to be stable jobs. And making Mexico pay for a border wall or doing whatever you're going to do with NAFTA isn't going to necessarily help their economy that much, which is only going to push people more and more into places that are stable, where they can pursue the lives that they want to live at a statistically less violent rate.
Right. I mean, look. I mean, you have illegal immigrants. They're breaking the law. I get the argument for this. And my argument is, I mean, we need to figure out a better way for immigration. It shouldn't be 20 years waiting to be allowed to immigrate. It's absurd. It's absurd. And studies right now are showing that even illegal immigration is down because the price has gone up so high that people can't afford it. So it's just, I don't know. To me, this is really just a non-issue. There needs to be immigration reform that allows these people that aren't coming here to commit crimes. They aren't criminals. They don't have criminal records. All this stuff can be checked in a background check. It needs to be expedited. And just this arguing and bickering over immigration is so old. I'm so tired of hearing people talking about jobs being taken. It's just not.
If jobs are being taken, the unemployment rate would be through the roof and not basically stable, minus the recession, for as long as it's been. I mean, people have been complaining about illegal immigration for 25 years, which is ridiculous. I mean, I'm a big fan of look, you have X amount of time for amnesty, and after that time, you are more than welcome to come to the United States if you're here illegally, get your citizenship stuff done. We'll take care of it. You're a full legal immigrant, and now you're paying into Social Security and all that stuff, right, aside from the sales tax you've already been paying.
Yeah. To me, that's only a benefit.
Yeah, and
to
then
have
it goes
more
back
taxpayers.
to you've had your time, and that's it. Assuming that we don't do that, I think that if you happen to get somebody that is an undocumented immigrant or an illegal immigrant, I don't know what the kosher term is nowadays. I was reading earlier today that some people consider illegal immigrant to be an offensive term. I don't know. That they go through go through the deportation process if there's a justifiable reason, violent background, conviction of a crime, something like that. But I think it is a huge waste of resources to go out and target these things. It's a massive waste of money, of effort, and time. I mean, and also all you're doing is I don't like the ripping families apart argument. I think Kelly Goff on Left, Right, Center put up a decent argument about that. But you're just not doing anything productive at all. You have people that they're paying sales tax, they're involved in the economy. Well, they really don't have the ability to take any type of government benefit. I keep hearing about, I keep hearing, I haven't heard too much since we got out of college and stopped, hanging around that one really aggressive guy who liked the college Republicans a lot. You heard about anchor babies and how they're getting welfare and getting Social Security. And I'm like, you have to have like numbers and things to take care of these. And I'm sure there are examples where these things happen, but by and large, that's just not the case. It seems like this big boogeyman that has been built up, which, again, I think it's being riled up as part of nationalist populism to take internal problems and project them and make them look external.
Right. I mean, I think we're pretty much in agreement on this. To me, the biggest thing is Trump once again trying to force through some executive order that he doesn't have the power to do, and getting shut down. And I mean, this goes back to something we discussed last week or the week before about the fact that the Republicans have the majority and they still are just incapable of getting anything done. And I believe it was Matt Welsh that talked about it in the fifth column this week about Republicans just aren't built to legislate, I believe is the word he used, but that could be wrong.
Mm-hmm.
They're just not built. They're not built to work together. There's too many factions within the Republican Party to get anything done, which we're going to talk about further when we get into healthcare next. But yeah, this is just another case. I do want to touch on we can end on this. The immigrant hotline, that illegal alien that Trump set up for basically people to call in if they've had a crime committed against them or seen a crime committed by an illegal alien. I'm not sure how they know that this person's an illegal alien. I'm assuming you just call because you saw someone that's not white commit a crime, and then you call and try to rat them out. But they've been inundated with space alien reports, which I just thought was great. And I thought we could end on that since the story's a little dry. But
yeah, it's good.
So, the last topic, the big one. Let's talk about this week. I don't know if they haven't voted on it yet, but they've discussed they've amended the healthcare, the Republican healthcare bill that they're going to repeal and replace. That isn't repealing or replacing anything. It's amending the ACA. So essentially, from what I can gather, it's just allowing states to waive out of the pre-existing conditions clause. They can opt out of the essential health benefits requirement, stuff like that. Interesting enough, the members of Congress and their staff are exempted from their policies getting opted out, basically being charged more for pre-existing conditions or age, which I feel would be the more likely reason why their policy would go up. Though I did read today that somebody in Congress, one of the representatives, said that he was going to remove that amendment. He was not going to let that happen, but he hasn't done it yet. So take that for what you will.
Yeah, First of all, I'm surprised that members of the Freedom Caucus decided to go ahead and endorse this new version. And well, I shouldn't say I'm surprised. I'm frustrated. But
that's the thing too. Is so essentially you're not going to have. I don't think you're going to get Justin Amash voting for this, but or Rand Paul. But if you get them, you're not gonna get McCain that's gonna vote for this.
Oh yeah.
So there's to me, from what I've gathered from various outlets, is this will pass the first tier, but it's not gonna make it through the Senate.
Oh, God, no. I don't think it will at all. Because I mean, obviously the House is more polarized than the Senate is, but I mean, it's so frustrating that this is it's just a classic, to me, abuse of federalism. And I get the federalism, leave these things up to the states, but I mean, I literally just looked at CNN and they had an interview with him, and he said, "Oh, no. The pre-existing conditions are in there. Well, except for the part that you say the states can opt out of it and make giant pools of people that have pre-existing conditions that aren't covered, and what the state's probably just going to get a big block grant for it or something to that effect. I mean,
Right.
it allows the states to undo everything that's there, and they think it's a perfectly acceptable bill. I mean, I know that I feel like you have stronger opinions about healthcare than I do. I mean, I used to be raging, just leave it up to the free market. You know, if you let them buy insurance across state lines, everything will change. Everything will be fine. And my opinions have changed a lot. I still really don't quite know how I feel or what I think, you know, health insurance should be, how we should have health care. But I mean, watching this bill is absolutely absurd. It is like I don't like the Affordable Care Act. The Affordable Care Act, I mean, there's a lot of ways that it leads to increased costs, but I don't think that this is even remotely any better by any stretch of the imagination, because the federal government gets to pass the buck and go, oh, well, Mississippi decided to defund people with pre-existing conditions. It's not our fault. Blame that on Mississippi.
Right. I mean, in a perfect world, you would want the states in charge of this, but I just don't see. I mean, they're talking about their pre-existing conditions. You get paid more or priced out. Old age, based on your age, you pay more. You get priced out. The essential health benefits requirement covers a list which includes outpatient care, emergency services, hospitalization, pregnancy, maternity, newborn care, mental health and substance abuse services, prescription drugs, rehab, laboratory services, preventative care, pediatric services. So essentially they can opt out of health insurance. Like they're gonna opt out of this.
all those basic things.
Yeah, all these things that are health insurance, they can opt out of. To me, it's just absurd. The problem with the ACA, and we've talked about it recently, is the fact that it's funded in a piecemeal fashion from this tax here, this tax there, and so it can be defunded through these taxes. It's to me, it's a half measure. It should just be. It should just be. It's single payer healthcare. It's not the best, but at this point, like, you can't go back. If you're the best country in the world that you claim to be, you're gonna make America great, then we should be able to ensure and take care of the health of our citizens.
Yeah.
We pay for anything else. We have payroll tax that goes to Social Security to make sure that if you work your entire life, you have something to retire on. That was set up by FDR, who was also trying to pass a universal healthcare bill before his death. Like, this stuff has been talked about, and people rail against FDR for this, but has anybody repealed the payroll tax or tried to get rid of Social Security? Yeah. It's just one of those things. You might not like the tax, but you'll enjoy being able to go to the hospital if you need it.
Yeah, I work with a lot of MDs, and one of them is from Canada, and she's a rather conservative lady. But we were talking about American healthcare system. She's like, your healthcare system is atrocious. She's like, I hate high taxes in Canada, but I would rather have the high taxes and have the healthcare system that we do. So it's sort of an anecdotal thing. But I've been going through and I've been reading Elizabeth Rosenthal's book, An American Sickness. And she's been going through and just examining, when she's an MD and a journalist, and she's been examining why America's healthcare costs are so high. And one of the big issues she has with Obamacare, and again, you and I have discussed this, I think it's a really good point, is that the Affordable Care Act, I hate saying Obamacare, slip of the tongue, sorry. The Affordable Care Act, its goal was to get people insured, not to do anything about costs. And the Affordable Care Act has a requirement in there that 85% of income or profit or funds for an insurance company has to be spent on healthcare. And that just means that insurance companies are more than happy to pay higher and higher prices that hospitals are charging because it's easier to meet that 85% goal then. And then they can just bill for other things later. I mean, it's really interesting going through this book and looking at the 60s through the 70s when Medicare came in. Hospitals kind of started to charge a little bit more, and when, especially when insurance became much more popular and much more prevalent, they started to charge just more and more, and they found that insurance companies would pay whatever they wanted to, and hospitals totally restructured themselves. They started, as opposed to like with the first insurance companies, the first insurance was Blue Cross, and it was out of Austin, Texas, and they had like a ton of bills, and they said, okay, well, why don't we sell what is just modern day insurance to people? We'll give them a 21-day stay in the hospital for like $5 a month, which at the time was like $150 or something like that, and they were able to recoup their losses, and people got health care relatively cheaply. And that entire process shifted so that hospitals became business oriented. I mean, instead of you just get a total for what you were there for, they're charging by every procedure. They treat these things like hospitals. You get a special stay, you get a charge for staying, you get a charge for anything, and they manipulate billing practices. You can get there with 2 days for observation, and that means absolutely nothing. You were never officially admitted, and they aren't liable for anything now. A lot of hospitals have shifted the way that doctors get paid. Either they're paid entirely based off of procedures that are performed or that are called to be performed, or they have incentives and bonuses off of those things, so that hospitals have codes 1 through 5, 1 being, oh, he stubbed his toe, and 5 being, oh, wow, his head is in a different room. And doctors will upcode like crazy, so that there was a great example. The doctor was doing surgery. Before he was doing surgery, he nicked himself with a needle. And he was like, oh, crap, I need to go get this taken care of. So he goes, gets it taken care of, and he gets like a $12,000 bill. That's what it all came out to. And he goes to the administration. He's like, why did I get this ridiculously high bill? Greg did a blood test, and I'm fine. And he looked at it, and it was observation, his stay for the room, charge for the people that did the lab. And it's just fascinating watching that hospitals are willing to charge more and more and more, and other people will just pay it. My dad's theory, my dad's a big market healthcare guy, but his theory is that healthcare is just expensive because we want everything covered, and the more things are covered, the more we go, and the more we're willing to pay because we don't feel the cost. And if you have insurance, it's great, but if you don't have insurance, you're screwed, and it's impossible to get insurance. Sorry, another rant.
Right. I mean, there's downsides. There's pros and cons to this, but to me, the pros outweigh the cons in making sure that people are covered. Currently, under the ACA, we have more people covered by healthcare than ever before in history. Correct?
I suppose so. Yeah. I mean, I honestly don't know the numbers off the top of my head.
I don't want to say that as a concrete fact, 100%. But from what I've gathered, that's I won't say in history. We have a very high number of people insured than it was 15 years ago. We can go with that. We still have a very high number of people that are more than that it's cheaper for them to pay the penalty than it is for them to pay for whatever marketplace insurance they were offered. So, I mean, there's still cons and there's issues with the ACA, but it's better than the alternative. It's better than the alternative. I mean, we have other systems. You have the United Kingdom, which has the NHS, which is a publicly funded healthcare system similar to Canada, which I believe, I mean, they're both single payer. But then you have Switzerland and Germany, which are multi-payer, which your employer and the employee split the cost of the system, but you have to have health insurance, which I believe is sort of similar, but way more in depth, and obviously has been reformed and built over the years, whereas ours is, I mean, it's when you actually read into the ACA, it's very slapped together. So I can agree with the GOP when they're going in and say this needs to be. I don't agree with repeal and replace. It needs to be reformed, and there should be cost saving measures because they're spending too much money in the wrong places. I think we've already discussed that. You're forcing these insurance companies to spend 85% of their profit, but you're not actually checking to see where it's going. So they're finding loopholes because you've left gaps a mile wide. There's
I think
issues.
one of the best arguments that I've heard in favor of a single-payer system is a utilitarian argument. It's an economic argument. And while currently I think it's... Basically, we already do have subsidies for healthcare. The money that we have that isn't taxed, there's about $350 billion of untaxed money each year goes to our healthcare. So that's basically already a subsidy. And
Well, you have subsidies through the ACA. If you sign up for the ACA, it takes your income and then subsidizes the plan that you choose.
Yeah,
it essentially gives you a subsidy, and you can use that subsidy to then determine what plan premium you can afford.
Yeah, but what I'm getting at is for the people that are like, oh no, we don't need any government interference. We just need the insurance that we have as it is. Well, we kind of already have a lot of subsidies from the government. But the best argument that I've really heard, and I've played devil's advocate with some of my more conservative and libertarian-oriented friends about this, is an economic one. If you put out a little bit more money in the short term to invest in a single-payer healthcare system, in the long term, with the focus on preventative care and having easy and cheap access to a quality healthcare system, or just a healthcare system in general, you will save money because you'll have a healthy populace. You'll be able to you'll experience more economic growth, and you'll have people that wouldn't be able to contribute to the economy contributing more. It's again the old conservative adage of a rising tide lifts all boats. If you're healthy, you're going to be just as healthy under a single payer as you were under your current insurance. And in a lot of places that have a universal but not single payer system, you can buy supplementary insurance. Germany is one of those places. But if you cannot afford health insurance and you switch and you get a single payer system, the access to healthcare that you have will make a better life, will make you more involved, and there's a utilitarian effect where everyone benefits. And there can be, in a couple of decades maybe, an offset of the cost of what a single payer healthcare system would be by economic stimulation.
Yeah. I think we're getting to the same conclusion here. I'm just
saying
it needs to be right. I'm in favor of the ACA. Not everything that it's doing, but it is helping people that can't afford healthcare or couldn't get healthcare because of conditions that they had. It's helping them get insurance. It's helping for a healthier, happier society. You have cynics that will say otherwise. But to me, it's still a half measure.
Panels.
Yeah, those death panels that are killing people. But I mean, we deserve to at least try something more. It's clear that we're not going to go back to the way healthcare used to be. There's no way it's going back to that. It's just too much public outcry every time they put up one of these healthcare reform bills where they say they're removing this, that, and the other, and it's pretty clear to me that they're not going to be able to pass.
And a lot of Republicans don't want it either, because the primary benefactors, by and large, of the Affordable Care Act are poor, working-class white Americans that live in conservative states and conservative districts. They don't want this thing to pass. They don't want to have to vote for it because they know there'll be pushback. And also, you and I talked about this before, but one of my favorite things about the Affordable Care Act is that it had a provision in there about hospitals keeping their tax-exempt status. So hospitals are tax-exempt. Historically, this has been done because hospitals contribute some stuff pro bono, contribute some to charity. And hospitals make a ton of money. You can get presidents of hospitals making $6 million a year. I mean, it's ridiculous. But one of the provisions in the Affordable Care Act said if you want to keep your tax-exempt status, you need to prove to us that you are contributing charitable in charitable ways that you are losing money. And for the tax breaks that a lot of hospitals get, they're only doing about 50% of whatever they're getting in a tax break. I think in The U.S. last year was like $3 billion were given in tax breaks for the tax-exempt status of hospitals or something to that effect, and they were only doing approximately $1.5 billion worth of charitable work. So they end up making money through these tax breaks because of the way hospitals are run. I mean, I know that when you start to get into some single-payer systems, there are the problems that I've always heard is it's longer waits and the quality can suffer. And I mean there is a legitimate point to that. It can take a lot longer to be seen, especially if you want to be seen by a specialist, than in a country with single payer than it is with a country with an insurance system like we do. That being said, a lot of doctors in the United States specialize and open up private practices and surgery centers so they can charge ridiculous amounts of money. So a lot of people specialize in the United States on purpose and leave general practitioners to just kind of hanging out in the wind. But it's sort of another thing.
Yeah, and I've also heard I've heard this argument recently that it would somehow lower the income of these doctors, and it's expensive to go to medical school, and that's a really bullshit argument. I mean, I told you today the average income of a doctor in Canada is still like $330 million. I mean, not million, $330,000.
Yeah, the only income that went up in the United States for any profession during the recession was doctors, and it went up decently. I mean, you can make a killing doing it. I don't know. It's going to be one of those on-running things.
You've spoken to me about this before, about how essentially the hospitals, and you just kind of touched on it with them essentially lying about the charitable works they were doing and making a profit. They're corporations. They're there to make money. They're not necessarily there to help people the way that you would think.
Hospitals shut down entire wings or entire units because they don't make money. Hospitals expect emergency rooms to make money, which you aren't. There's this expectation in the United States that we can turn a profit off of everything. And healthcare is something that, unless you have long-term preventative care focus, you're not going to make money off of. And then part of the reason you aren't going to make money off preventative care is the way that health insurance is billed and paid for. There's a bias towards not cognition and not prevention, but treatment and like diagnostics and procedures. That's how people get paid, is through those things. It's hard to quantify what looking at an MRI and thinking about the best thing to do in preventative care costs. It's easy to quantify. What does an MRI and a surgery cost? The way that we have our healthcare market set up is biased towards aggressive billing and non-preventative care, which is probably the best thing you can do.
Right. Well, yeah, I think I don't know. I think we've kind of come to the same conclusion. I think this is a single payer system is what we should head towards. And
I think it's an inevitability. I know that I want to research more.
I don't know that it's an inevitability, just because there's so many people that are going to fight it, because it's almost like, I mean, nobody wants to look into it. It's just a single payer. You mean I got to pay for my neighbor to have health care? Sure, if that's how you want to look at it, but
you pay for your neighbor to drive on the roads.
But that's the general mindset when they hear that. So it's one of those things. I wouldn't say it's inevitable that's going to happen. I think that it's something that we should try. That I think would be in the best interest of citizens.
I think it's inevitable for a long, convoluted theory that I have about what conservatism is, but we really don't have time to get into that because
we're coming up on an hour now. We're past an hour.
So I think we should hit our This Week in Trump.
Oh yeah, we forgot. I was getting ready to do the outro. Okay, so This Week in Trump. Hold on. Let me pull up.
This is a new segment that we're doing. I wanted to call it "Guess What Trump Did This Week," and
it's not quite as interesting. But we have Trump coming out in a few interviews this week, basically saying he thought being president would be easier than his old life. He apparently loved his previous life. It was so much easier, and he just thought being president was going to be a cakewalk, right? Also, so in his first 100 days, it's chaotic, and he blames the Constitution for why that is. And
that
there's
pesky
more
Constitution that keeps me from just doing whatever I want.
Yeah, I want to be the CEO that just makes rules and everybody has to listen to me. He backed down. We obviously had the almost. The government didn't shut down Friday. It was almost.
Nah, they extended it for a week.
Then he backed down. He's backed down on his demands for a down payment on his border wall, which
And
I
he
didn't
backed
really
down
see
on
the point.
saying that he was going to defund Obamacare too.
Yeah,
the
he's
Affordable Care Act.
threatened that twice. I actually had that in my notes. He's threatened that twice to withhold the subsidy payments, and both times he's backed down.
That's a deal maker in chief right there.
Yeah. Well, could you imagine if he did that? It would be
Yeah.
insane. But and then the most important, let's take that with a grain of salt. He invited the Filipino leader Rodrigo Duterte.
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 Yeah.
Which
Yeah.
I don't know
So
if you've
Duterte
actually
is
looked into this
responsible
guy.
for-
Go for it.
Duterte is responsible for 7,000 deaths in the Philippines in his effort to combat the war on drugs. He also is gone on record as saying that he wished he could have sexually assaulted a woman before she was executed. He is an attorney, has gone to the International Criminal Court, and they are trying to investigate him and bring him up on charges of mass murder. I mean, this is not a nice person at all. This is a bad guy by any stretch of the imagination. And the biggest irony is Duterte has, if we remember a few months back, Duterte went on this huge rampage about how much we didn't need the United States. We can sever ties. The Philippines can stand alone. And now he's coming to the White House. He's going to be hosted. Trump said they had a great conversation and is looking forward to having him and visiting the Philippines, where he has a tower that's about to open later this year. Another hotel.
I believe that's where he's going to be setting up his Legion of Doom, which will have the Chinese president, Maduro from Venezuela,
Erdogan,
and then Erdogan, and they'll just build this little. And Putin was part of it, but they have parted ways. Putin is making his own. Which we didn't talk about this, but we should mention there was a peaceful protest in Moscow this week where protesters lined up and laid handwritten notes under they're basically just being surrounded by SWAT teams, military police, to basically ask Putin not to rerun for election this year, next year.
If you could do us just all a favor.
Yeah.
Real quick.
But, so, that's this week in Trump. And, yeah, that's the show. So,
yeah,
we're on, like I said, every week we're on SoundCloud, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher. We set up a YouTube channel where we're posting the podcast every week now, so you can get us anywhere. Website's still in the works. I'm lazy. It's hard. So
I'm lazier. I pass the buck off to you for that.
Do you have anything else to add to that?
Next week we really want to do a little research over the course of the coming week, so we can talk about the German elections a little bit more, dig into some of that, because that's going to be coming up, and with Russia currently, well, I shouldn't say Russia specifically, but outlets like RT and Sputnik launching a very aggressive anti-Macron campaign, and with the report that we talked about last week about the heavy influence of junk news in favor of far-right candidates in Europe, that's going to be really big coming up with the German elections. So I think we want to do a little research into that, start touching on that early. I think that's the only thing I can think of off the top of my head.
It's good enough for me. Let's call it a show. That's a wrap. See you next week.